really the biggest challenge for first home buyers? Is it saving the deposit or paying off the mortgage? In this episode, we untangle a bit of confusion around this question.
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to get it right.
I'm Megan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mums. But that's a good thing because between us, we've got over 40 years experience and we are going to share with you bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure that you get unbiased and real information that you can rely on so you can get where you want to be without missing a step.
Now, we've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au. There you'll find free checklists that you can download, a free mini course on how to price a property, and our Where to Buy workshop for only $39. Priceless stuff, really.
Bargain. But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, here's the boring bit, the disclaimer. You, of course, know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field of expertise. Now, we've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording, but things change. So check with the relevant government authority or your advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Recently, we saw this headline, $155,934, shocking salary you need to afford first home guarantee. And it got us thinking about the importance of having a balanced view of how income and savings worked together. But before we get to that, there's a special house that you have behind you in the video this week, Megan, and I can guarantee no first home buyer is going to be buying this one. Rather unique.
Nor you and I, probably.
No.
You and I have both actually driven past this house at different times in our lives. Mm-hmm. This is the Pole House at Fairhaven Beach in Victoria. Now, it is across the road from the beach. So the Great Ocean Road actually goes across in front of it. And it's about 40 metres above sea level. I can only imagine what the views must be from up there and how windy it must be.
That's the thing that I get. The wind must be horrific.
It must howl through there.
And also it must vibrate. Like it literally is this house sitting on a pole, on a stick,
pole.
With a big long sort of walkway from
like a lollipop.
Yeah, I've never liked it, to be honest. I think it's far too exposed and I wouldn't feel
Certainly
safe.
A conversation point.
But hey,
imagine getting up there.
Incredible.
If the lift wasn't working.
Is there a lift up the middle of that pole? This would be like Centrepoint Tower. All right. So even though you may aspire to that one, we're not going to recommend anyone buy it.
There's a few fundamentals missing there, but it has got scarcity factor.
It definitely has scarcity. I actually think I heard that you can stay there.
It's Airbnb, is it?
I think, but I could have that wrong. So fact check me, someone. Send us a message. All right.
Don't go knocking on their door.
Back to the topic at hand. How much money do you really need to take advantage of first home, loan guarantees and all that stuff? But it's also really how much money do you really need to buy a property? And it's not just the savings, is it?
No, look, it's all well and good to say that the greatest challenge that first home buyers face is saving the deposit. Therefore, the answer must be to get them into the property sooner. But is it really? I think this is the thing that you and I debate constantly. And the less deposit you have, the more you have to borrow. And the more that you have to borrow, the more you need to be able to pay on a regular basis. That is every month or every week or however you set your payments up. So just because you can save less to get into something more doesn't mean you can actually afford it on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So this idea comes with a lot of consequences and it comes with a huge amount of risks. Veronica, you've got some examples here that you'll take us through so that people understand what we're talking about here, because just because you have saved a little bit and you want to get into a property may not mean that you should.
Yeah. And we've talked about in previous episodes about buying A grade, B grade, C grade property, and anything that encourages you to buy a B or a C grade in order to get into the market, you have to look at very, very seriously. But back to that sort of, the less deposit you have, the more you have to borrow. And I think this is a really important thing that people sort of, it gets a bit glossed over. There's politicians, so we're helping first home buyers, we're helping you get into the market sooner. And it's like, yeah, that's fine, but can I afford the repayments? Not to speak of negative equity, which we will get into a little bit later. But
now, can I just, quick disclaimer, we're recording this during the election campaign. This is not one of the election, we're not pulling apart one of the election policies here. This is the existing scheme that is in place as at the 18th of May.
Correct.
So this is actually in place.
Correct. This was actually announced in the last federal election, in sort of towards the end of the campaign as well, interestingly enough. Anyway, so
why we're talking about it is they've actually increased the price caps. So it's topical right now because they've increased the price caps on how much you can pay for a property to still qualify.
And it makes for great political sort of announcements, because like now more people can take advantage of it. Hang on a minute. So we saw this article, which we'll put the link in the show notes too, which is that shocking amount of money you need to earn to be able to qualify for the highest
great headline,
price cap.
but there was actually some really good information below that headline.
Yeah.
Sometimes you read the headline and go, that had nothing to do with the article.
It did choose the worst example, but hey, don't they all? So say, for example, that you buy a $700,000 property. Now, forgetting purchase costs for a moment, let's just look at the actual cost of the property. And if you have a 5% deposit, right, so you'd be borrowing $665,000, right? You probably borrow more actually if you have to pay costs, but let's just for the purposes of this exercise. And your repayments, if you assume a 3.5% interest rate, right, which is slightly more than you probably have to pay right this minute, but hey,
we're heading in that direction.
Yeah, we are. So your repayments on $665,000 with that 3.5% interest rate would be around $3,339 per month. Whereas if you had a 20% deposit, you'll be borrowing only $560,000 and your repayments will be $2,813 a month. That's using the same calculator. So you'd need enough income to cover an additional $500 a month. Right. So, of course, if you were saving, you'd be saving that towards your deposit. But you have to remember that, once you commit to a property, you're no longer saving, you're repaying a mortgage. And you probably don't have a buffer either if you only had 5% deposit.
And you can't take a breather.
Yeah. Takes your cash flow takes a battering. And you got to start to try to, from that point, to try to build a buffer, try to build some sort of safety net around you. And I think that's the thing that sort of, oh yeah, great, I can get the market sooner, but your ongoing costs, you've got to be able to manage them.
Yeah, you do. And buffer is a really important word, Veronica, because we harp on about it quite a bit in your first home buyer guide. And it is about having some money there that's sitting there, and it is savings. You've got to get it somehow. Some money that's sitting there in case something goes wrong. Now, we highly recommend people talk to insurance brokers about personal insurances like income protection and TPD and all of those sorts of things that can kick in if something drastic happens. But if you simply go through a period of time where you can't work for a reason that isn't covered by any of those insurances, or you have a long lead time into when you qualify for one of those insurances, you have to have the ability to pay the mortgage during that period. And if you push yourself to your absolute limit and you haven't been able to build a buffer, or you haven't got a buffer there, there's great risk in that you may fall behind in your repayments, and then you've got to catch them up again somehow.
Yeah, so whilst the headline for this article, which you can read if you want to click on the link in the show notes, is
it's a good read, actually.
It is a good read.
Yeah, there's some really good examples in there.
It's about, well, how much do you need to earn in order to repay the mortgage if you went to the top? So, and I'll explain that in a moment. But the reality is that income is really important for home buyers, not just about how much you can borrow, but also how much you can repay, because obviously the amount you can borrow is determined by your income, not by your savings, right? How much you can repay comfortably, but also how your cost, your quality of life is, and your contingency planning, for instance, as you're just talking about there, that's all dependent on income as well. So this whole idea about, get first home buyers in with 5% deposit, it sounds really great, but you've got to dig underneath that and realize, what you're buying into and the commitments that you're making. And then there's the risk of negative equity, which is pretty scary.
So important, because equity is, of course, the difference between what you owe and what the property is worth. That's your equity. That's the thing that you kind of own. The bank owns the other bit, which is what you owe. So that equity bit, when you only have a 5% deposit, of course, you have less equity in the property. And if there is a correction in the market, which we're starting to see in some aspects of the Australian property market, and particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, and particularly in B and C grade properties, if a correction comes that brings a slight decline in prices, you may actually end up in a negative equity position. So actually owe more than what the property becomes worth if it decreases in value. And that is the biggest risk, I think, because the bank may turn around and ask for you to tip some money in to help top up to that 95% lend again. That's hard.
Yeah. And also, we don't want anyone buying and then suddenly having to sell, right? We don't want you buying anything that you're going to lose money on. And think about this. I always say to people that forget all these home loan guarantees or whatever. Say you had 20% deposit, right? So lovely, big, fat, chunky deposit. You've got good income and you've got the extra 5% of purchasing costs because you got to pay stamp duty. Let's just assume you're paying stamp duty. I know that there's plenty of first home buyers who want to avoid paying stamp duty, and I understand why you want to avoid it, but let's assume you have loads of cash, you've saved it all, or you've been given a lot of money and you've got the income to support the mortgage. You buy that property. Now, if you then suddenly have to sell it, say you get divorced, say you relocate overseas and it's not viable to keep it, say anything in life happened that means you need to sell it, you really need a 5% gain anyway just to cover the costs.
So
the cost to get that property in the first place was 5% on top of the purchase value. You want it to have gone up 5% just to make sure you break even if that happens. Right?
How many times have you seen a property come on the market, Veronica, that they purchased 12 months before, except for this market where things are rising rapidly, but they've purchased it 6 months before, change in circumstances, and they go, all right, well, I paid this. I need to recover my 5% cost plus the agent's commission of 3.5%. So I need an extra 8.5% to get out of this property. That assumes that the market has risen that much. And of course, people are smart enough now to know that just because you paid it doesn't mean that it's worth it now.
Yeah. This happens remarkably often. And I don't know about in your neck of the woods, but I don't even look beyond my own sort of little, microcosm of where my business is located, for instance. I did an exercise when did I do it? 2019. And I actually reviewed properties that had sold I think it was the last 2 years prior to the end of the last boom, and then on sold within 18 months, right? So I just reviewed all these properties. I got 50 without trying too hard, 50 examples. Most of them in those market conditions had lost money. Most, Ouch. Not all, but most. And even at the beginning of this boom that we just sort of had, I started tracking properties that had same deal, changing hands in some of them less than 7 months, like less than 12 months. And fine, they're lucky. They lucked it in line with the market, and some of them made extraordinary gains. But, obviously their circumstances changed and they just had luck on their side. The first bunch, those 50 properties that I evaluated a few years back, they didn't have luck on their side, and they had still needed to sell. And I think that's an important thing to understand. If you remember one of my favourite reports, the Pain and Gain report, CoreLogic's Pain and Gain report. And in fact, Kent and I are working on another one, which is the win-loss report. So we're working on a more refined version of that.
Oh, fabulous.
The Pain and Gain report showed that over that period of time, something like 13% of properties sold at a loss. And even in the last one I read, which came out, I think it was the December quarter 2021, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's around about 8% of total properties sold in that quarter sold at a loss, even in a rising market.
In a rising market. Yeah, so we've got to be incredibly, incredibly careful with that.
So the risk of negative equity has been experienced by a lot of people.
And I think it's underplayed.
Those people may have they may have been able to pay their mortgage off because they owned or they paid it down, or they'd actually had a 20% deposit in the first place and they lost less than that, but they actually sold for less than they paid. And so when you sell for less than you paid, when you've got a 5% deposit, the risk of you actually ending up owing more than you get for that property is huge. So
it is much greater, plus what you put into it that you've lost as well.
Yeah.
So there's a double hit there. Now back to the article with the shocking headline, because it's a cracker. It was referring to the price caps. So this is the change that's taken place, middle of May. So, for example, in New South Wales, the maximum price you could pay for a property in Sydney or a major regional centre and still qualify for this scheme is $900,000. Now, this is where the attention-grabbing headline comes from about salary. They have worked out that you need a salary of $156,000, and they've calculated it. And honestly, it's a great read, and it's a bit of an eye-opener, I think, if you haven't really thought this through. They've calculated that a couple with a car loan, because we need to go from house to house, house to business to shops, school to sport, and 2 dependents, so average kind of family structure, they'd need to earn $155,934 and able to get a mortgage of $855,000. So numbers are $900,000 purchase price is the maximum cap. 95% of that is $855,000. To service that from a bank's perspective on current interest rates, you need to earn about $156,000. Now that's way above the average income.
But it's also, that's for a couple, with 2 kids and a car loan. The thing is that, and I've often said this, and I know it's unfair, but it is what it is, right? Property in this country is expensive, right? We can fight against that. We can argue against that. We can get mad about that, but it's a fact. And the minute you own a property in this country, you do not want it to go down in value.
You want the prices to keep increasing.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And each one of you, if you're in the first home buyer camp at the moment, you're trying to get onto the ladder, and, we get that it's difficult, which is why we're here, right? But the fact is, the minute you buy, you do not want prices to fall. Because otherwise, why would you? Why would you buy?
And you move very quickly from one frame of reference to the other. It's the moment you buy that property, you want prices to go up.
That's exactly right. I don't want to feel stupid for having purchased this property. I want to feel like I made a good decision. I want to feel like I've really set myself up financially. I want to feel like I'm really looking after my family. I've got security. You won't feel secure if you owe the bank more money than the property is worth. You won't feel secure if you really are hand to mouth with your repayments, and then an interest rate interest rate rise comes, which there are going to be more. I mean, I think we can be fairly, I don't need to be predicting anything to say that. We've been told
inflation can't be controlled in any other way except to curb spending. So what does the Reserve Bank do? Anyway, we digress. That's a whole nother topic, and other experts who analyse that a lot more closely. But it's safe to say that we have been on these fantastically low interest rates for an extended period of time. It's not sustainable, and you have to factor in that there are going to be interest rate rises in the short term, and I think for the medium term as well. So when you're factoring that in, banks are going to start to look at a higher assessment rate. And therefore, you have to earn more money to be able to service that higher interest rate.
That's right. So whilst it's true, and I think there was recent headlines around saying you now needed 11.4 years or something to save up a deposit to buy a house in Sydney. And it is just insanely expensive. I get that. And looking at a 20% deposit hurdle is huge. And obviously looking at a 5% is less, much less, right? It seems achievable.
Absolutely, it starts to look achievable. Yeah.
It's the next part of that equation that is really important. And that is where focusing on income is really important. And it's like some people, like they'll go and take a second job. They go and drive Ubers or do, I don't know, do deliveries or whatever to get their deposit. And that's fine. Well, yeah, and that's fine if to do that, to squirrel away and to save deposit in a shorter period of time. But you've got to be thinking, can you sustain that?
Is it sustainable?
Yeah, in order to repay the mortgage. So a lot of focus does need to be on the income. And I know that, we're not career advisors at all, but, you are your greatest asset. Can you go and upskill so that you can earn more money? I mean, these are the more sustainable ways of helping you into home ownership in a way that actually is hopefully going to not burn you out.
Career trajectory. Yeah. And then how reliable is that career trajectory? Or are you banking on something that may not actually come off? And that's a difficult thing. If you think, well, if interest rates go up, I'll apply for that promotion. That's not a given. There's a risk factor there, and how much you're prepared to play with that risk is very unique to you. But you want to have a really good think about whether, how likely is it that your income will rise if interest rates rise. It's not highly likely to happen overnight. There's usually a career path that takes you in that direction. But that's how people do leapfrog strategies. They start with the smaller, manageable at this point in time. Then when the career takes off and their income increases, that's when they can start looking at actually increasing their mortgage or servicing a higher level of debt.
Yeah. And saying all this, what's going through my head too is thinking, oh my God, you want to do a job you really enjoy. So there becomes the challenge. If you before you bought the property and you're thinking about making a career change because you actually hate your job, get that done before you buy. Because once you get locked into a mortgage, you're pretty stuck there. If you're on a good earner and you don't really like what you're doing, that's a
You've got to
big
service
commitment.
the mortgage. Yeah. It's no time to start a small business after you've committed to a large mortgage based on a set income.
Not unless it's a side hustle.
Yes. And I guess that side hustle, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I was just going back to the Uber driving and the Amazon deliveries and all of those sorts of things. Banks may not take that income into consideration. So just because you have used that income to accelerate your deposit saving strategy, it is highly unlikely that it will be used, taken into account as part of your serviceability or how much the bank will actually lend you. So don't rely on that when you go to a broker to talk to them about how much your borrowing capacity is, because those sorts of side hustles, they're not guaranteed income to the extent that the bank would like to see that income consistency.
So the moral of the story is that even if you have the savings or an inheritance, if you don't have the income to support a mortgage at the right level, you won't get the finance, right? And then if you're pushing the upper limits and you really need to budget in, for rate rises to be safe, because we want to make sure that, if you do go out there, you can't basically just put yourself right on the wire to buy your first property and then you have no contingency plans, no fallback position. And you're stretched and life is not fun.
Yeah. And this, I guess, we've sounded a bit negative during this, but it's because we like to make sure that people understand their risk before they enter into these sorts of schemes and opportunities. The opportunity in and of itself is not a bad one. It is actually a good one. What we want you to do is understand what the risks are, so that when you go in to look at this as an option for you and talk to a broker about, well, can I do this, that you've actually thought about these other contingencies, these other risks, and you can manage for those. So don't just focus on the 5%. Look at the whole picture. Can you service it? What happens if interest rate rises? What happens if the market corrects and drops a little bit? All of these things. If you cover these off, then the surprises that might come at you unexpectedly, you've got a toolbox of responses to say, all right, well, I've already got my contingency because I've got my buffer over here and I'm comfortable.
Absolutely. Our real mission here is to help you be educated so that you can make confident decisions. And then you don't fear taking on debt, because you have covered off this stuff and you do understand it. So yeah, you're right, Megan. I think we have sounded a bit negative. We're very, very positive.
We're positive about this.
Yeah.
Do it well with your eyes wide open. In this episode, we've covered a very small part of our 10-step online course for first home buyers. If you would like to learn more about the process and how to buy without making a mistake, then head over to our website, www.homebuyeracademy.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you like what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. 5 stars would be wonderful. It will help others find us as well.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with some more priceless stuff.